My ex-wife kept bullying me. Her Harvard grad husband boasted at a party. Then I told the truth. Imagine standing in a room full of your past mistakes, your biggest critics, and the one person who said you'd never amount to anything. That's exactly where I found myself, and what happened next left everyone speechless. Stick around to hear the shocking conclusion, because you won't believe how it all turns out. As I stepped out of the car, and into the cool evening air, my hands brushed the lapels of my jacket. A nervous reflex I hadn't been able to shake. I glanced up at the towering building in front of me, its sleek, modern facade a reminder of how far I'd come. This wasn't just another evening. This was Zenith Tech's annual gala, a black tie event that had become a cornerstone of the industry calendar. For years, I'd only heard about it in passing, a distant milestone that seemed as unreachable as the stars. Yet here I was, standing on the sidewalk, my polished shoes gleaming under the streetlights, my heart thudding against my ribcage. Grace stepped out of the car a moment later, and when I saw her, it felt like the whole world paused. She was stunning, as always, her emerald green dress catching the faint glow of the building's entrance. Her presence calmed me, reminded me of everything I'd worked for, everything that mattered. She smiled at me, a quiet confidence in her expression that made me feel stronger. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady, reassuring. I nodded, slipping my hand into hers. Together, we walked toward the grand entrance. The revolving glass doors hummed faintly as we stepped through them and into the ballroom's dazzling interior. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The hum of polite conversation mixed with bursts of laughter, and the soft clinking of champagne flutes. A string quartet played in the corner, their music filling the space with a refined elegance that seemed almost surreal to me. The last time I'd worn a suit like this, it had been a rental. This time, it was custom-made, and though it fit perfectly, it still felt strange on me, like a new skin I wasn't quite used to. We handed our coats to the attendants, and I glanced around, taking it all in. The room was a shimmering sea of sharp suits, tailored dresses, and confident smiles. CEOs, venture capitalists, top engineers all gathered under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers and elaborate floral arrangements. It was the kind of setting that once seemed like a distant fantasy. The kind of place where deals were made, where futures were decided. Grace squeezed my hand lightly as we moved through the crowd. I nodded politely to a few familiar faces, exchanging brief pleasantries as we made our way to the main hall. Every so often, I'd catch a glance from someone who seemed to recognize me, but their expressions often shifted quickly, as if they were trying to recall where they'd seen me before. It wasn't that long ago that I'd been just another name in the industry, another face in the crowd. Now, I was standing at the helm of Zenith Tech, a company that had managed to carve out a name for itself in a brutally competitive market. As we entered the ballroom, the full scale of the evening hit me. The tables were covered in crisp white linens, adorned with elaborate centerpieces that likely cost more than my first car. Servers in impeccable uniforms glided between guests, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked more like miniature works of art than food. A large stage dominated one side of the room, its backdrop a sleek projection screen cycling through images of Zenith Tech's recent achievements. Seeing those images, those accomplishments that had once been mere ideas scribbled in notebooks late at night, sent a wave of pride through me. I felt Grace's hand on my arm, her silent encouragement grounding me, as we found our place near the stage. It wasn't just about the celebration, it was about the journey that brought me here. I couldn't help but think back to where I started. The long shifts at the factory, the nights spent studying by the dim light of a second-hand desk lamp, the years of scrimping and saving, just to make ends meet. The memories weren't just distant echoes, they were part of me, woven into my very being. I remembered those moments like they'd happened yesterday. The sting of being told I'd never amount to anything, the hollow feeling of coming home to an empty apartment. After a 14-hour shift, the relentless doubt that whispered in the back of my mind every time I faced another setback. But I also remembered the first time I fixed something that no one else could. The first time a supervisor looked at me and said, "You've got potential, kid." I remembered the day I got my degree, the day I walked out of that factory for the last time, and the day I signed Zenith Tech's first big contract. Those were the moments that built me, that shaped me into the man I was now. I glanced at Grace again. She was talking to someone I vaguely recognized, one of the board members of a rival company. Her confidence, her poise, her belief in me, they'd been a constant source of strength. There were times, especially in the early years, when I wasn't sure I could keep going. But she never doubted me. Not once. And tonight, I felt that same steady support, that same quiet reassurance that I wasn't doing this alone. The evening carried on, a mix of introductions and polite conversation. I met investors who had only heard of me by reputation, executives who nodded approvingly when they learned I was the one behind Zenith Tech's recent breakthroughs. It felt surreal, standing among these people as a peer, not just an aspiring entrepreneur hoping for a lucky break. And yet, even as the night unfolded, there was an undercurrent of unease. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but I felt it in the glances that lingered a little too long. In the brief, subtle shifts in conversation when I walked past. I wondered if they were still trying to place me, still trying to connect the dots between the young mechanic I once was and the man standing before them now. Or maybe it was just me, still not fully comfortable in this new skin, still adjusting to a world that once felt so far out of reach. But I pushed those thoughts aside. This was my moment, my night to show the industry, the world, and most importantly myself, that I belonged here. As the string quartet's music swelled and the first speeches began, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. As the evening settled into its rhythm, I found myself moving through the crowd, engaging in polite conversation with familiar faces and the occasional new acquaintance. The room hummed with an undercurrent of energy, that particular blend of ambition and celebration that seemed to define the world of high-stakes tech. Investors clustered in small groups, leaning in as they exchanged secrets about upcoming deals. Engineers, some still young enough to be called prodigies, gestured excitedly as they described breakthroughs that would undoubtedly change the industry. The laughter, the clink of glasses, the string quartet in the corner, it all created an atmosphere that felt almost surreal. For years, I'd imagined what it might be like to stand in a room like this, to feel like I belonged. And now that I was here, it still felt like a dream I hadn't quite woken from. Grace was by my side, her hand occasionally brushing mine as we navigated the throng. Her smile was calm, her presence grounding, and I could tell she was proud, not just of me, but of what we'd built together. I was mid-conversation with one of our senior developers when I heard it. A voice from my past. One I hadn't expected to hear again. "Ethan, is that you?" The words hit me like a shock of cold water, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined them. Turning slowly, I saw her. Mia. She was standing just a few feet away, a glass of wine in hand, her expression a mix of surprise and amusement. For a split second, the years seemed to rewind, and I was back in that tiny apartment, watching her pack her bags, as she told me she was leaving. "I need someone better," she'd said, her voice full of that same faint condescension. I heard now. I took a steadying breath and forced a polite smile. "Mia," I said simply, my tone carefully neutral. She looked me up and down, taking in the tailored suit, the polished shoes, the slight sheen of confidence that I wore now like a second skin. "Wow," she said, her smile widening. "I didn't expect to see you here. What brings you to an event like this?" Her tone was casual, almost light, but there was an edge to it, a subtle undercurrent of doubt, like she couldn't quite believe I belonged here. My pulse quickened, though I kept my expression calm. "I'm the keynote speaker," I replied, meeting her gaze. The words seemed to hang in the air between us, and for a moment, she looked genuinely surprised. Then she laughed, a soft, dismissive sound. "Keynote speaker," she repeated, shaking her head. "Well, I guess some things really have changed." Her tone didn't quite match her words. It was more mocking than impressed. Before I could respond, a man stepped up beside her. Tall, well-dressed, with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "David, this is Ethan," Mia said, gesturing toward me. "Ethan and I go way back." David's gaze flicked to me, cool and disinterested, before returning to his drink. "Nice to meet you," he said, his voice smooth but lacking any real warmth. He looked like someone who was used to being the most important person in the room. Someone who'd never had to fight for a place at the table. The kind of person I'd encountered too many times before, people who had everything handed to them, who coasted on connections and pedigree, rather than actual skill or hard work. I didn't know you two knew each other, David added, his tone vaguely curious, though it felt more like a formality than genuine interest. Mia smiled, tilting her head slightly. Ethan and I were married once, she said, as though it were some amusing anecdote. A long time ago. David's eyebrows raised slightly, but he said nothing. Mia turned her attention back to me. So, you're speaking tonight, she said, her voice still carrying that faint note of disbelief. That's surprising. I met her gaze evenly. It's been a long road, I said simply. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she quickly recovered. David chuckled, a low, almost patronizing sound. Well, congratulations, he said. I'm sure it's a big step for you. He said it casually, as if trying to downplay the significance, as if this was just some small accomplishment in a long list of more impressive feats, none of which, of course, belonged to me. I glanced at Grace, who stood quietly beside me. Her presence was steady, unshakable, and it reminded me that I didn't have to prove anything to them. Not tonight. Not ever. It is a big step, I replied calmly. I'm glad to be here. Mia sipped her wine, her gaze lingering on me a little too long. Well, she said, a hint of condescension creeping back into her voice. It's nice to see you're doing well. I wasn't sure how things would turn out for you after everything. Her words hung in the air, unspoken but clear, after she left. After she walked away, convinced I'd never amount to anything. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The silence seemed to unsettle her more than any rebuttal could have. David glanced at me, his expression unreadable. It's a tough world out there for startups, he said casually. Most don't make it. But hey, good on you for giving it a shot. The comment was so blatantly dismissive that it almost made me laugh. Instead, I just nodded. It is tough, I said, keeping my tone steady. But we've done all right so far. Mia raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. We? She asked, tilting her head. I met her gaze evenly. Zenith Tech, I said. My company. We've been growing steadily for a few years now. The words seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she masked it with a tight smile. Well, she said, her tone light but strained. That's great. It's good to see you're making something of yourself. She gestured vaguely with her wine glass, as if dismissing the topic. Anyway, we should catch up more later. I'm sure you have plenty of people to talk to. She placed a hand on David's arm, as if signaling that the conversation was over. I nodded politely, my expression neutral, and watched as they turned and walked away. As they moved deeper into the crowd, I couldn't help but notice the way Mia glanced over her shoulder at me just for a moment, as if she wasn't entirely sure what to make of me now. Grace touched my arm, her voice soft. You okay? I looked at her and smiled. Yeah, I said. I'm fine. And I was. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. I didn't need Mia's approval, and I certainly didn't need David's. I didn't need to prove anything to them. I'd already proven it to myself. I had fought tooth and nail to get here, to build something real. Something that mattered. And no amount of condescension or dismissive remarks could take that away. The gala continued around us, the music swelling, the chatter growing louder, but in that moment, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in years. I was exactly where I needed to be. Right when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, I uncovered a truth that changed everything. What do you think happened next? Did I confront them head on, or did I walk away silently? Comment #111 if you think I fought back, or #224 if you think I stayed quiet. As I moved through the crowd, I couldn't help but let my thoughts drift back to where it all started. Seeing Mia again, standing there with that faint smirk on her lips, and David at her side, had stirred something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like a reminder, a sharp jolt of memory that brought me back to the beginning. I remembered the first time she told me she was leaving. The words had come so easily to her, as if she'd rehearsed them a dozen times before finally saying them out loud. Ethan, she'd said, her arms crossed and her voice steady, I need someone better. Someone who can give me the life I deserve. I'd stood there in our tiny one-bedroom apartment, still wearing my work boots, the grease from the day's shift staining the knees of my jeans. I just finished a 16-hour shift at the auto shop, and all I could think was, better? Better than what? Better than someone who worked every waking hour to keep the lights on, to make sure there was food on the table? She packed her bags while I watched, stunned and silent. When the door finally closed behind her, it left an emptiness that I couldn't fill. The days after that felt like a blur. I threw myself into work, taking on extra shifts wherever I could. I started looking for a second job, then a third, just to keep my mind occupied. There were mornings when I came home as the sun was rising, my hands blistered and my back aching, and I'd collapse onto the couch because I couldn't even make it to the bed. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, not with the rent due and bills piling up. The fridge was often bare, except for a few cans of soup and a half-empty bottle of ketchup. I lost count of how many times I skipped meals, just to stretch every dollar as far as it would go. Those were the days when I didn't think about the future, because the present was overwhelming enough. And yet, even in the midst of all that, there was something else. Something small and persistent that refused to let me give up. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was more like defiance. Every time I heard Mia's words echoing in my head, someone better, I felt a spark of determination ignite. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew one thing for sure. I was going to prove her wrong. Not by shouting it from the rooftops. Not by chasing after her and begging her to come back. I was going to do it the only way I knew how, by working harder, learning more, and finding a way out of the mess I was in. That's when I started taking night classes. It wasn't an easy decision. I had no time, no money, and no idea if I'd even be able to keep up. But I knew that if I didn't at least try, I'd never forgive myself. I enrolled in a local community college, signing up for an introductory engineering course that met 3 nights a week. My schedule became a punishing cycle. Wake up at 6, work 2 jobs back to back, rush to class, then go home and study until my eyes couldn't stay open. I slept 4 hours a night, 5 if I was lucky, but I refused to quit. I couldn't afford to. The first few weeks were brutal. I felt out of place, surrounded by students 10 years younger than me who still had the energy and optimism. I'd lost somewhere along the way. I doubted myself constantly, wondering if I was too old, too tired, too far behind to ever catch up. But then something unexpected happened. I started to understand the material. The equations that had seemed like a foreign language at first began to make sense. The concepts that had felt out of reach started to click. I realized that the problem-solving skills I'd developed in the shop, diagnosing engine troubles, improvising solutions, figuring out how to make old parts work like new, weren't so different from the engineering principles I was learning in class. In fact, they gave me an edge. I wasn't just memorizing formulas, I was applying them, seeing how they worked in the real world. One night, after a particularly grueling day, I stayed after class to talk to the instructor. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with a sharp wit and a knack for breaking down complex ideas into manageable pieces. "Professor Carter," I said, hesitating as the rest of the class filed out. "Do you think I have a shot at this?" She looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "Ethan," she said, "I've seen a lot of students come through here. Some of them have all the resources in the world and still don't make it. Others have nothing but determination, and they surprise everyone. You're one of the determined ones. Keep working at it, and I think you'll be just fine." Her words stayed with me, a small flicker of encouragement in a sea of doubt. I kept at it, night after night, week after week. Slowly, things began to change. I started getting better grades, earning the respect of my classmates, and even catching the attention of other professors. My work in class led to a part-time internship at a local engineering firm, which meant even less sleep but more experience and a foot in the door. The more I learned, the more confident I became. I started to see a future that didn't involve scraping by paycheck to paycheck. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could build something better for myself. Looking back on those days now, it's hard to believe how far I've come. But seeing Mia and David at the gala tonight brought it all rushing back. The long hours, the self-doubt, the endless grind. It wasn't just a distant memory. It was a reminder of why I worked so hard, why I pushed myself beyond what I thought I was capable of. It wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was worth more than they ever believed. That spark of defiance I felt back then has never really gone away. If anything, it's only grown stronger. pushing me forward, driving me to keep climbing. I kept thinking back to that first night in the shop, when I was still just the new guy. It was a cold January evening, and I'd been there less than a month, fumbling through the basics and trying not to get in anyone's way. The other guys didn't talk to me much, just grunted a yeah or no if I asked for help. And I could tell they didn't think I'd last long. I wasn't sure I would either. The shop floor was loud, the air heavy with the smell of oil and exhaust, and every time I turned around, it felt like someone was yelling at me for doing something wrong. I had never worked with my hands before, at least not like this, and every new task felt impossible. By the end of my shift, I was usually exhausted, covered in grime, and wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. But that night, everything changed. One of the senior guys, a grizzled old mechanic named Hank, was struggling with a car that had been on the lift for hours. No one else wanted to touch it. It was a mess. The kind of job that could eat up an entire shift and still not be finished. I don't know what possessed me to walk over and offer to help, but I did. Hank gave me a look that could have melted steel. "You think you can fix this?" he asked, his tone more mocking than curious. "You've been here what, a month?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But I've been watching you, and I think I see what the problem is." He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but he stepped aside and let me take a crack at it. I climbed under the car, my hands shaking as I reached for the tools. I'd been watching Hank all day, studying how he worked, how he approached problems, and I had a hunch about what was going on. I started tracing the lines, checking the connections, following the path of the issue back to its source. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel Hank's eyes boring into me the whole time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I tightened one last bolt and climbed out from under the car. "Try it now," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. Hank got behind the wheel, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. The other guys in the shop stopped what they were doing and turned to look. I could feel their stares, their surprise, their disbelief. Hank climbed out of the car, crossed his arms, and gave me a long, measuring look. "Not bad, kid," he said finally. "Not bad at all." I stood there, trying not to let my relief show, but inside, I felt like I'd just won the lottery. For the first time, I felt like I belonged, like I could actually do this. That night, I went home with a newfound sense of purpose. I didn't just want to get through each day anymore. I wanted to get better. I started staying late, watching the senior guys work, asking questions when I could, and practicing on old parts that no one needed. It was hard, frustrating, and sometimes downright humiliating, but I kept at it. Slowly but surely, I started to understand the machines, how they worked, what made them tick. I wasn't just fixing cars, I was learning how to solve problems. And as my confidence grew, so did my responsibilities. The foreman started giving me more complex jobs, and before long, I was the guy people came to when they couldn't figure something out. The turning point came about 6 months in, when the shop's biggest client brought in a high-end sports car that wouldn't start. The client was furious, pacing back and forth, threatening to take his business elsewhere. No one wanted to touch it. It was too risky, too easy to make a mistake that could cost the shop thousands. But I volunteered. The foreman raised his eyebrows, but he didn't stop me. "Your funeral, kid," he said, handing me the keys. I spent hours on that car, poring over every inch of it, testing every wire, every connection. The client kept glaring at me, but I tuned him out. I was in the zone, completely focused on the task at hand. When I finally found the issue, a small, hidden relay that had shorted out, I almost couldn't believe it. I replaced it, crossed my fingers, and turned the key. The engine purred to life, smooth and perfect. The client's face went from anger to astonishment in an instant. "You fixed it?" he asked, as if he couldn't believe it. "I fixed it," I replied, my voice steady. The foreman clapped me on the back, the other mechanics nodded in approval, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had truly accomplished something. That experience changed everything. I realized that I had a knack for troubleshooting, for finding solutions when others gave up. I started seeing problems not as roadblocks, but as puzzles to be solved. I became the guy people came to when they needed answers, and that reputation followed me everywhere I went. It wasn't long before I started thinking about the bigger picture. If I could solve problems here, in this small shop, what could I do with more training? More knowledge, more resources. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. I had never imagined myself doing anything more than this, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. The more I learned, the more I realized how much I didn't know. That realization drove me to push myself harder. I started reading technical manuals in my spare time, watching videos online, and experimenting with new techniques. I saved every extra penny I earned, planning for the day when I could go back to school. It wasn't easy. There were days when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was chasing a pipe dream. But then I'd remember that moment with Hank, that first big win, and it would remind me why I started down this path in the first place. It wasn't just about proving me wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I was more than just a guy with a wrench in his hand. I was a problem solver, a fixer, someone who could take on challenges and come out on top. And no matter how hard it got, I knew I couldn't stop. I'd already come too far. I'll never forget the first time I walked into that engineering classroom. It was a small lecture hall with rows of creaky wooden desks, and the air smelled faintly of old textbooks and chalk dust. I was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep, after pulling a double shift at the shop. My hands were still sore from tightening bolts all day, and I hadn't even had time to change out of my grease-stained shirt. As I took a seat near the back, I felt every pair of eyes in the room glance in my direction. Most of the students were fresh out of high school, wide-eyed and eager, wearing clean clothes and carrying brand new laptops. I stuck out like a sore thumb, but I didn't care. I was there for one reason, and one reason only: to learn. The professor walked in and started writing equations on the board, talking about things I'd never heard of before: stress-strain relationships, finite element analysis, load distribution. For the first 20 minutes, it was like listening to a foreign language. My head swam with terms and formulas that seemed impossible to grasp. But instead of feeling discouraged, I felt something else. I felt a spark. As the lecture went on, I started to see patterns, connections. It reminded me of working on the cars back at the shop, figuring out which part connected to what, understanding how the system worked as a whole. I didn't have all the answers, but I could see that if I kept at it, I might just get there. After class, I stayed behind, waiting for everyone else to leave before I approached the professor. He was an older guy, late 50s maybe, with a thick New England accent and a no-nonsense attitude. I introduced myself and asked if I could get some advice. He looked me up and down, taking in the stained shirt, the calloused hands. "You a mechanic?" he asked. I nodded. "You've got a good foundation then," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "This stuff won't come easy, but you're used to solving problems, aren't you?" I nodded again, not sure what to say. "Good," he said. "Start with the fundamentals. Get your hands on the old texts. Don't worry about being the smartest in the room. Just be the one who never stops asking questions." I took his advice to heart. I found a battered second-hand copy of Engineering Mechanics, and started reading it every chance I got on the bus to work. During my lunch break, late at night when the shop was empty, I kept a notebook full of questions. Every time I didn't understand something, I'd write it down and look it up later. Slowly, piece by piece, the material started to make sense. I began to see how the theories in the textbooks applied to the real world. It wasn't just math. It was the language of design, the code that made buildings stand, bridges hold, engines run. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to know. At first, I struggled to keep up in class. My grades were decent, but I knew I could do better. I stayed late after every lecture, pestering the professor with questions until he waved me off. I formed study groups with the younger students, even though I felt like the odd one out. I wasn't trying to be the smartest, I just wanted to understand. I would go home and try the problems again and again, sometimes reworking the same equation 10 different ways until I finally got it. There were nights when I felt like giving up, when the weight of it all, work, school, bills, felt like too much. But I couldn't let myself quit. I kept thinking about the shop floor, about Hank in the sports car, about the client who looked at me like I was just another nobody until I proved him wrong. Those memories pushed me forward, kept me going even when my tank was empty. By the end of the first semester, I noticed a shift. The professors started calling on me more often in class, and I began answering questions with confidence. The younger students stopped seeing me as just the old guy in the room, and started coming to me for help. I wasn't the best student, not by a long shot, but I was the most determined. That determination earned me a spot in a competitive internship program at a small but respected engineering firm. It wasn't much, just a few hours a week helping with design reviews and test setups, but it was a foot in the door. For the first time, I was working on something bigger than myself. Something that could actually make an impact. The internship changed everything. I started applying what I'd learned in class to real-world projects, and the connection between theory and practice became clearer. I worked under engineers who had been in the field for decades, soaking up every bit of knowledge they were willing to share. One of them, a soft-spoken structural engineer named Carl, took me under his wing. "You've got an eye for details," he told me after I pointed out a flaw in a prototype design that everyone else had missed. "And you don't quit. That's more valuable than any degree." Those words stuck with me. They reminded me that I didn't need to be perfect. I just needed to keep pushing forward. I spent long hours at the firm, staying late after my shifts to run extra tests or tweak designs that weren't quite right. I started to see the fruits of my labor not just in the results we achieved, but in the respect I earned from my colleagues. They began trusting me with more responsibility, and I rose to the challenge. The projects became more complex, and so did the problems. But by then, I wasn't afraid of them. I welcomed the challenge. Every problem was an opportunity to prove that I belonged, to prove that the long hours and sleepless nights had been worth it. And as the months went on, I realized something. I wasn't just a mechanic who happened to study engineering. I was an engineer. I was someone who could take an idea and turn it into reality. Someone who could solve problems that others thought were impossible. Looking back on those early days in that lecture hall, I never would have imagined how far I'd come. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. And as I stood there at the gala, looking around at the polished suits and elegant dresses, I knew that every sacrifice, every struggle, every moment of doubt had led me to this place. I wasn't just part of the crowd, I was part of the future. By the time I started working full-time at the engineering firm, I felt like I had finally found my rhythm. Every morning, I'd walk into that office, past the sleek glass doors and into the bright, modern workspace, where ideas flowed as freely as the coffee. The engineers there were a mix of old hands who had seen it all, and fresh faces eager to prove themselves. It was the kind of place where the hum of conversation was constant discussions about designs, debates over materials, the occasional heated argument over which solution was best. I thrived in that environment. It wasn't just a job anymore, it was a calling. I spent my days poring over schematics, analyzing data, running simulations, and learning everything I could from the people around me. They didn't treat me like an outsider. They treated me like a peer, and that was all the motivation I needed. The first big project I worked on was a component for a new piece of medical equipment, something that would make treatments faster, safer, and more affordable. It was the kind of challenge that excited me, but it also scared me. There was a lot riding on it, and I knew that one misstep could cost the company not just time and money, but potentially lives. I remember sitting at my desk late one night, long after most of the office had gone home, staring at the design on my screen. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The numbers added up. The materials were sound, but I had this nagging feeling that something was off. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples, trying to figure out what it was. Then it hit me. The component stress points weren't evenly distributed. Under heavy use, it could weaken over time and eventually fail. It wasn't an obvious flaw, most people wouldn't have caught it, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I went back into the system and started making adjustments. I redesigned the load paths, reinforced key areas, and optimized the geometry to ensure even distribution. It took hours. By the time I was satisfied, the sun was starting to rise, and I was running on nothing but adrenaline and black coffee. I saved the file, printed out the new schematics, and left them on my supervisor's desk with a note explaining the changes. Then I went home, showered, and tried to catch a couple hours of sleep before heading back in. When I walked into the office that morning, my supervisor was waiting for me. "Ethan," he said, holding up the printouts. "You caught something we all missed. This could have been a huge problem down the line. Good work." I tried to play it cool, but inside, I was beaming. That moment reaffirmed what I had known deep down. I belonged here. I wasn't just getting by. I was making a difference. Over the next few weeks, that project became my primary focus. I worked closely with the team, refining the design, running stress tests, and making sure every detail was perfect. When the final prototype was completed and passed all the tests, the sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. The client was thrilled. The project was a success, and I had proven to myself and to everyone else that I could handle the pressure. As time went on, I took on more responsibilities. I started leading smaller teams, mentoring younger engineers, and contributing to larger projects. Each success built on the last, and I gained a reputation as someone who could deliver results. But it wasn't just about the recognition. It was about the impact. Knowing that the work I was doing had real-world consequences, that it could help people, save lives, make a difference was what drove me. I thought back to those nights in the shop, covered in grease, wondering if I'd ever have a chance to do something meaningful. Now, I was living that reality. It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks, long hours, and plenty of moments where I doubted myself. But every time I hit a roadblock, I remembered where I started and why I was doing this. That reminder kept me going. And then came the opportunity that would change everything. The firm was bidding on a major contract to develop a new system for renewable energy storage, a cutting-edge project that could set the standard for the industry. It was a massive undertaking, and the competition was fierce. Our team was one of several being considered, and the pressure to deliver a winning proposal was intense. I was assigned as the lead engineer for our submission, which meant weeks of research, design work, and countless revisions. I spent hours in the lab, testing materials, running simulations, and brainstorming with the team. We worked late into the night, fueled by takeout and determination, driven by the knowledge that this project could define our careers. The day we presented our proposal to the client was one of the most nerve-wracking of my life. We walked into their headquarters, a sprawling complex with state-of-the-art facilities, and set up in a large conference room. As the client's executives filed in, I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't just about showing them our design. It was about proving that we were the right team for the job, that we had the vision, the expertise, and the determination to make it happen. When it was my turn to speak, I took a deep breath, stood up, and began walking them through our proposal. I talked about the challenges we faced, the solutions we developed, and the rigorous testing we'd conducted to ensure the system would perform under real-world conditions. I explained how our design was more efficient, more reliable, and more cost-effective than anything else on the market. And I did it all with a confidence I hadn't even realized I had. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. The client's lead engineer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd been drilling us with questions throughout the presentation, leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and nodded. "This is impressive," she said. "You've clearly put in the work, and it shows. I think we've got something to talk about." Those words were all I needed to hear. When the client officially awarded us the contract a few weeks later, it felt like a dream come true. The project was a resounding success, and our work gained national attention. I was invited to conferences, asked to speak on panels, and featured in industry publications. It was a whirlwind, but I never lost sight of what mattered most, the work itself. Every challenge I faced, every problem I solved, every late night and early morning, it was all worth it. Because in the end, I had proven not just to others, but to myself, that I was more than capable. I was exactly where I was meant to be. As the night wore on, the tension in the ballroom started to shift. What had once been a casual, celebratory atmosphere was now laced with whispers and stolen glances. I could feel it in the way people looked at me, the sudden quiet when I passed, the way conversations stopped just a moment too long before resuming. For a while, I tried to ignore it. I stuck close to Grace, making small talk with investors, exchanging polite nods with other executives. But the whispers grew louder, the glances sharper. I knew something was building, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then I saw her, Mia, making her way through the crowd. She was smiling, laughing at something David had said. Her arm linked through his. She looked polished and perfect, like she always did. But there was something in her eyes. Something that wasn't there before. She spotted me and stopped. For a moment, I thought she might turn away, pretend she hadn't seen me. But instead, she smiled slow, deliberate, like she was savoring a secret, and walked straight toward me. David followed, his usual smirk firmly in place. "Ethan," Mia said, her voice smooth and sweet, but with that familiar edge of condescension. "We were just talking about you. How interesting that you're here tonight." Grace's hand tightened on my arm, just slightly, and I took a steadying breath. "Mia," I said, keeping my tone neutral. David glanced at me and then at Grace. "Enjoying the evening?" he asked, as if he cared. I nodded. "It's been nice. And you?" "Oh, we're having a wonderful time," Mia said, her smile never wavering. "It's such a lovely event. Though I must admit, I was a little surprised to see you on the guest list. I didn't realize Zenith Tech was involved." Her tone was casual, almost light-hearted. But there was an undercurrent to her words, a hint of something more. I knew her well enough to recognize it. She wasn't just making conversation. She was testing me, probing for weakness. I smiled faintly. "Well, it's been a busy year for us. We've had some exciting new developments." "Oh, I'm sure," she said, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "David and I were just talking about how competitive the industry is. It's not easy to stay ahead, is it?" "No," I agreed. "But we've managed to do all right." David chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "I'll bet you have," he said, his tone just on the edge of patronizing. "It's tough out there, though. A lot of smaller companies struggle to keep up. It takes more than hard work these days. You need connections, resources, the right people in your corner. That's what separates the players from the, well, you know." I met his gaze evenly. "That's true," I said, my voice calm. "But sometimes, hard work and innovation can go a long way." "Of course," Mia said, her smile tightening. "But then again, not everyone can make it in this business. It's a shame, really, how some people just get left behind." She said it so casually, so offhandedly, but I knew exactly what she meant. I had to remind myself to stay composed, to not let her get under my skin. I glanced at Grace, who gave me a small, encouraging smile. I could feel her steadying presence, her quiet strength. "That's true," I said. "But sometimes, the ones who get left behind have a way of catching up." For a brief moment, Mia's smile faltered. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but I saw it. David, however, didn't seem to notice. He was too busy scanning the room, his smirk firmly in place. "Well," he said, "I'm sure it's all very exciting. But at the end of the day, it's about staying in the game. And that's not always easy." "No, it's not," I agreed, my tone even. "But sometimes, all it takes is one good move." I let the words hang in the air for a moment before glancing at Grace. "Shall we?" She nodded, and we turned away, leaving Mia and David standing there. As we walked away, I could feel their eyes on me. And I knew the game was far from over. But for the first time, I wasn't playing on their terms. I was playing on mine. It was later in the evening when I saw David again. Standing by the bar, nursing a drink and chatting with a group of well-dressed investors. His laughter carried over the room, loud and confident, as though he were still the center of the universe. I watched him for a moment, weighing whether to approach. Grace had gone to find a colleague, and I was alone, standing near a tall marble pillar. The murmurs of conversation washing over me. Something about David's demeanor struck me too comfortable, too sure of himself. He had no idea what was coming, and the thought made me smile. I stepped away from the pillar, and crossed the room. David noticed me just before I reached him, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by that smug grin he always wore. "Ethan," he said, his voice smooth, as if we were old friends. "Enjoying the night?" "It's been good," I said. "How about you?" "Oh, you know how these things go. A little networking, a lot of handshakes. But it's always good to reconnect with people." He gestured to the men around him. "I was just telling these gentlemen about the work we're doing at Apex Tech." "Apex Tech," I repeated, tilting my head. "That's the company you joined after Stratline, right?" David's grin widened. "Correct. I'm in charge of their strategic partnerships now. It's a competitive market, but we've been making some big moves. Really exciting stuff." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "It's impressive." The way you've stayed on top in such a tough industry. Thank you, he said, clearly pleased with himself. But then again, it's all about positioning. Knowing the right people, making the right moves. That's what keeps you ahead. He took a sip of his drink, then added, of course, it doesn't hurt to have a strong team behind you. And a little bit of luck. The investors chuckled politely, and I forced a small smile. Luck, I said. That's always helpful. David gave a short laugh. Exactly. And speaking of luck, I hear Zenith Tech's been doing well. It's good to see you found your footing. There it was again, his subtle, patronizing tone, as if he were handing out compliments from a position of superiority. I nodded once. We've been fortunate. Hard work helps too. Oh, no doubt, David said. But, you know, it's a different ball game at this level. It's not just about working hard. It's about making smart plays. It's about staying ahead of the curve. I leaned slightly closer, just enough to let my words land without sounding confrontational. Absolutely. That's why we made sure to position ourselves strategically when we signed the deal with BioMedX. The smile on David's face froze, just for a moment. The investors exchanged curious glances. BioMedX? David asked, his voice carefully casual. Yes, I said. They're our biggest client now. We've been working with them for months on a new product line. It's been a great partnership. David set his glass down slowly. I see, he said. That's quite a step up for Zenith Tech. It is, I said, smiling faintly. We've also been expanding our R&D department. In fact, I think you might be familiar with one of the teams we brought on board recently. They used to work with Straight Line, if I'm not mistaken. David's face tightened. Really, he said, his tone no longer so smooth. That's interesting. It is, I agreed. We've also been looking at some new acquisitions. You know, making smart plays. I let the words hang in the air for a moment, then added, I'm sure you understand. David's hand tightened around his glass. Well, he said, forcing a chuckle, it sounds like you've been busy. That's good. Staying busy keeps you relevant in this industry. It does, I said. Though sometimes it's about more than just staying relevant. Sometimes it's about staying in control. I could see it then, the faint crack in David's armor. He knew I wasn't just making polite conversation anymore, but he couldn't show it. Not in front of the investors. Not here. So he smiled, wide and forced, and raised his glass. Well, to success, he said. May we all keep moving forward. I raised my own glass, holding his gaze. To moving forward. As we drank, I couldn't help but notice the way his hand shook, just slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. As the night drew to a close, the energy in the ballroom started to shift. People were making their way toward the exits, shaking hands, exchanging last-minute business cards, and offering polite goodbyes. The conversations grew quieter, the clinking of glasses less frequent, as the crowd thinned out. Grace and I lingered near the back, watching the event wind down. She gave me a soft smile, one of those small but meaningful gestures that reminded me how far we'd come. For a moment, I let myself relax, taking in the success of the evening. But even then, I couldn't quite shake the tension that had hung in the air all night. I knew David was still there, somewhere in the crowd. He hadn't left yet, of that I was sure. He was probably working the room one last time. Trying to salvage something, anything, to take back with him. But no amount of glad handing would change what had happened. The whispers were already spreading, the truth making its way through the network of executives, investors, and influencers. The cracks in David's polished exterior were no longer just visible, they were undeniable. And that's when I saw him, standing alone by the bar, his drink untouched, staring at nothing in particular. His usual easy confidence was gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen before. Uncertainty. I glanced at Grace, and she gave me a slight nod, as if to say, go ahead. I made my way over to him, weaving through the remaining guests. He didn't notice me at first, too lost in his own thoughts. But as I approached, he straightened up, forcing that familiar smile back onto his face. Ethan, he said, his voice steady but lacking its usual luster. Still here? Thought you'd be off celebrating by now. I stopped a few feet away, crossing my arms. Celebrating what? I asked, my tone calm but deliberate. A good night? Sure, he said, shrugging. It seems like things went well for you tonight. Congratulations. There it was again, that forced politeness, that hint of condescension, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to admit the truth. I met his gaze, letting the silence stretch for a moment. Then I said, "You know, David, it's funny. I used to think people like you had it all figured out. That you were untouchable. But tonight, I realized something. You're not untouchable. No one is." His smile faltered just slightly, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger? Fear? I couldn't tell. But it was enough to keep me going. "I'm not here to rub it in," I continued. "That's not who I am. But I think you need to understand something. What happened tonight wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was the result of years of hard work, of making the right choices, of learning from my mistakes. And I think that's what separates us, David. You relied on status, on connections, on the illusion of power. But I built something real. And now, you're starting to see the difference." He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at me. Then he chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well," he said, his voice low, "I guess one underestimated you." "I guess you did," I replied. He sighed, looking down at his drink. "You know, Ethan, it's not as easy as you make it sound. This business. It's brutal. And sometimes, you have to make choices you're not proud of." "You think I wanted it to end up this way?" "I don't know, David," I said. "But I do know that choices have consequences. And tonight, those consequences finally caught up to you." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the man behind the facade. The man who wasn't as confident, as invincible, as he'd always pretended to be. He didn't say anything else, just nodded slowly, as if accepting what he couldn't change. And then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. I hadn't wanted to destroy him. That was never the goal. But I couldn't deny the sense of closure I felt as I turned back to find Grace. She was waiting for me by the door, her expression calm and steady. "How'd it go?" she asked as I approached. "Better than I expected," I said, taking her hand. "I think he finally understands." She smiled, and we walked out into the cool night air. The city lights stretched out before us, bright and constant, a reminder that life moves on, no matter what happens. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. I'd spent so long chasing success, proving myself, fighting to be seen and heard. But now, as we stood there together, I realized that I didn't need anyone else's validation. I didn't need to prove anything to David, to Mia, or to anyone else who had doubted me. I had already won. I had built something real, something lasting, something that mattered. And that was enough. And there it was, the moment they finally realized they had underestimated me all along. I walked out with my head held high, proving to them, and to myself, that no matter how low you start, the climb is always worth it. But the real question is, how would you handle a moment like that? Let me know in the comments below. In the end, I learned that success isn't about revenge or status, it's about hard work, integrity, and resilience. Anyone can stumble, but it's how you rise that defines you. When you commit to growth, take responsibility for your choices, and refuse to let failure define you, the American dream remains within reach. This country thrives on those who innovate, persevere, and give back. So, to anyone who doubts their potential, start small, keep moving, and never forget, your character and actions matter more than any title or connection. Build something real, and success will follow.